Hey students, thanks for jumping in on this particular lecture called Systems and Conflict. A couple things I want to point out about this particular lecture. You'll notice on Moodle I've arranged to have posted I don't know, 15, 16-minute clip from the movie Patch Adams. And I'd like for you to watch that and just sit back and watch the stuff that's in play when Patch kind of chooses to come alongside. I show this particular clip in my graduate program. I show it in a lot of different venues because there's a whole bunch just captured in that first few minutes that really explains a lot about what it means to listen, what it means to speak value into people, all kinds of good stuff there. So I hope you enjoy it. And the other thing I want to point out is as I've uh, worked my way into a lot of different places helping people fight fair, I've learned to look at conflict from a systemic perspective. And in just a moment, I'll show you what that looks like. I'll lay out some of the guidelines, some of the non-negotiables, if you would, of conflict as it relates to systemic. But let me encourage you, not just a result of this lecture, but on an ongoing basis, be aware of what's going on behind the scenes. Because in a system, the issue is never the issue. What you think might be happening at work, what you think might be happening on your athletic team, what you think might be happening at church, what appears to be happening or is presented as the issue really isn't the issue. So, anyway, welcome. We're going to talk a little bit about systems and conflict. There are just a number of concepts, very basic concepts, that we'll roll out here in the next few moments. Um, Issues of anxiety, issues of identified patient who is being blamed in this, uh, emotional triangles, homeostasis, emotional maturity, and unspoken rules. Now, when you read about conflict from a systems perspective, you're going to find other basic concepts by other writers. But these are the ones, just for purposes of our class, that I just want to tease out for you a little bit and talk about. One is anxiety. And when we talk about anxiety as system, we're not necessarily talking, about the worry and the kind of anxiety that gets diagnosed that some of us struggle with from time to time. We're talking more about what one writer calls just the emotional force field in a system. It's just kind of there, and there's anxiety in a system that's chronic. It's always there because of some unresolved issues. And there's acute anxiety, which is just kind of this heightened response to a challenge. Let me give you an example of chronic anxiety. A number of years ago, I worked with a church out in Ohio that had been going through lots and lots and lots of issues. They had actually succeeded in burning through going through four pastors in the last 6 years. And they brought me out to see if I would help them hire their next pastor. And I actually said no, because I said, there's too much going on and it has gone on in this church, that before you bring another leader in here, you need to deal with. Well, as was often the case, I got fired because nobody likes to hear that there's stuff that just sits there and you haven't really dealt with it. Well, systems are that way. There's chronic anxiety where it's always there because of some unresolved issues, and other systems have a heightened response to a challenge. They'll say, okay, something's happened and we need to deal with it. Anxiety is managed or mismanaged depending on the maturity of the leaders in the system. This is something I wish I had time to roll out for you all more, but I just need to tell you this. In the many systems that it's been my privilege to work with, I'll always go to see how the leaders are doing. Companies, live or die based on the emotional maturity of the leaders in the system. One of the dynamics we'll tease out in the next few moments is that a system will never rise above the level of maturity in its leaders. So if you're in a system right now that has, for instance, an unhealthy CEO or an unhealthy team leader or an unhealthy ministry leader, that's going to really, really impact the level of anxiety in a system. And when there is high anxiety, people choose reactive over rational. This is just a fancy way of saying when there's high anxiety in a system, people don't think clearly. They want quick solutions. They react. What are we going to do? Oh my, lions and tigers and bears. When, in essence, if we have emotionally mature leaders in a system, they will get that system to calm down and to think rationally. When there is high anxiety, people choose extremes. I got a call one night from a woman from a church that I had spoken in a number of months ago who proceeded to tell me over the phone that she believed that the elders of this church were demon possessed. I thought, wow, this is going to be interesting. Well, they're not, but she's pretty whipped out about something else going on in the system, and she chose extremes. When there's high anxiety, people blame and finger point rather than just take ownership. And we don't have time in this particular lecture, but there's a number of good examples out there and good resources to show you in other venues how anxiety is contagious in the system. Maybe an extreme example, if you ever want to do some research on what's called the My Lai massacre in North Vietnam. My Lai is spelled Mylai. It's a study of how anxiety really was pervasive over Charlie Company and then over an entire village that got destroyed. I mean, that's an extreme example. But suffice it to say, it's really important if you're going to do any mediation work, if you're going to understand and manage conflict in your own systems, to realize that sometimes if it's not contained, it becomes contagious. I've spent a lot of time with people in systems who believe that they use different language, but they're being blamed for what's going on in that system. It's the person or issue that's chosen to be the blame or the scapegoat in that system. It's usually a leader, but not always. I worked with a church that believed everything was just fine at that church until they changed the worship and specifically brought a set of drums up into the sanctuary. And there was a classic example where the identified patient, at least according to this person, wasn't a person. It was a set of drums, which was kind of weird. But one of the reasons this is important is because by default, when people are anxious, when a system is unhealthy, they will try to find somebody to blame. And if a leader is not emotionally mature, and if you're a leader who is being blamed a lot. Systems thinking is going to be good for you because um, it's not always your fault, but you'll get blamed as the team leader or as the minister or whatever. You'll just get blamed. The concept of emotional triangles. I just want to tell you all this. I've probably spent more time talking about emotional triangles in systems than I have any of the other basics components. And here's why. In some systems, it's really okay to talk about you instead of to you. Now, Jesus had some things to say about this in Matthew chapter 18, where he was really clear. And he said, listen, if you have something against someone or someone has sinned against you, go straight to that person. Don't go to anybody else. You can go to somebody else later if plan A doesn't work right or doesn't work. But this is one of those concepts that I find myself assessing really carefully in systems, saying, okay, in this system, is it okay for me to talk about you? Or is it expected that if I'm a part of this system, I will talk to you, not about you? In the scriptures, that's called gossip, by the way. But for systems thinkers, we take a real hard look at this reality that when two parts of a system can't mature up and talk to each other, they'll triangle in another. Sometimes parents do this with children. Sometimes leaders do this with other people in the system. And when I first started out doing some systems work, I thought, I'm going to go into a system and I'm the hired gun and I'm the interventionist and I'm the mediator and I'm going to just get rid of emotional triangles. Well, that lasted about a day because I discovered you can manage them, but you can't necessarily get rid of them. People will talk. But one of the reasons that emotional triangles just needs to be talked through and assessed in a system is because if you got a bunch of them going on, if there's a whole bunch of these pockets of influence where instead of talking to each other, we talk about each other, you've kind of got a mess and you've kind of got a funk. Organizations face higher anxiety when the leaders triangle with others in the system. Let me give an example of that for a moment. A number of years ago, it was my privilege to help a pastor and an associate pastor through a very, very deep conflict between those two. And one of the commitments I made with them, which I make with anybody in leadership, is to have them sign a covenant with me that under no circumstances will they talk to anybody else other than their spouses about the conflict they're experiencing. Because when leaders are in conflict, there's a lot at stake. There just is. And so these two individuals very definitely signed the covenant with me and said, under no circumstances will I talk with anybody else about this. I believe you, Dr. Rota, when you say the stakes are high on this one. We got to keep it to ourselves, all that good stuff. So they signed the covenant. The next time they met in my office, I just revisited that commitment they made. I asked the first gentleman, did you keep the agreement? And he says, yep, yeah, I did. I asked the second gentleman, I said, did you keep the agreement to keep this very confidential? And there was a little bit of awkward silence, and he said, well, not really. He said, I was so burdened about this conflict that I called up some members of my small group and asked them to pray about this conflict. And I said, you blew it. You shouldn't have done that. And he challenged me. He says, well, so you don't believe in praying about this? And I said, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about when you step outside the confidentiality, when you bring other people into this conflict that shouldn't be in the conflict, there's higher anxiety. Homeostasis is just a fancy word for status quo. And here's what's interesting about this particular system's dynamic. Um, some of you right now are perhaps in work environments where there's a lot of change. Some of you are in family systems where there's some change going on. And what's interesting about this system's dynamic is, and I've seen this happen over and over again, change that is good and even necessary often gets resisted because people, by default, don't necessarily like things to be stirred up. Even if what they're doing right now isn't working, the comfort of that, the homeostasis of that, is preferable. So, you see it, for instance, um, when churches change worship styles. I've seen churches unanimously say this is clearly the direction we need to go, and for whatever reason they even voted on it. But the first time that change gets implemented, people freak out. So it's important when you're assessing systems to say, is this system staying status quo? And what's the change factor? How do people respond when there's change in this system? Emotional maturity, it can be defined a lot of different ways, and I'm very, very thankful for the writings of Daniel Goleman and others who have written a lot about emotional maturity and emotional intelligence. But it's the capacity to define and abide by one's own life's goals and values in the midst of anxiety or pressures to conform. One of the reasons this is important is because when you are in the midst of conflict, specifically as a leader, but there's a lot of sabotage going on. There's people who want you to believe this or want you to sign off on that. And it's really important, if you want to be emotionally mature in the midst of that conflict, is to just stay true to your values. It's indispensable for the leaders in the system because the system will never rise above the level of maturity at leadership. Let me say that again. It's indispensable for the leaders in the system to be emotionally mature because, as I often tell them, you cannot expect the congregation, you cannot expect the system, you cannot expect the rank and file of this system to rise above the level of maturity in this room right now. And that sometimes just scares the bejeebers out of people because they realize they haven't been managing this conflict very well. And they haven't managed it very well because they're not emotionally mature. So, very important for leaders to be emotionally mature because the system will follow. And here's just some of the dynamics of emotional maturity: sense of your own limits and limits of others, clarity about beliefs and boundaries. This bullet point's an interesting one. I've challenged and been challenged over this one. Sometimes leaders will say that they have a certain conviction about a matter. And a conviction, if I understand a true conviction, it's actually something that I'd be willing to die for. I mean, it's that important to me. Well, a lot of times what gets marketed and framed up as a conviction really is just a preference. And it's important for leaders to know that and to say that out loud. Good leaders, emotionally mature leaders, don't adapt to please others. I'm amazed, and I tell you this honestly, folks, because I'm a recovering people pleaser. but I'm amazed earlier in my life, how many decisions I forged just because I wanted people to like me and I wanted them to be pleased. Well, come to find out, I realized, that not only ticks me off a lot, but it makes me very, very tired. And I'm not saying I'm there yet, but one of the things that you may want to look at carefully as you're trying to understand and manage conflict is, how vested am I in people liking me? And how much do I adapt to please others when I know that there's probably a better way to go about forging that decision? And you stay principled in the midst of sabotage and have a non-anxious presence about this last dynamic. I find just fascinating. Every system has unspoken rules, healthy or unhealthy. They have rules that aren't posted on the refrigerator. They have rules that are not posted in the break room, and you really don't know what they are till you break them. And I've broken enough of them, not on purpose, to know. As an example, I was asked to speak at a church, and I didn't necessarily see anything in there about what the dress code was. Well, I showed up to speak at this church, and I'm wearing Dockers and a nice sweater. Well, come to find out that one of the unspoken rules is that the talking head at that church is always supposed to wear a coat and a tie. I mean, it's kind of a male-dominated system, but yeah, they were pretty clear with me that next time, if there's going to be a next time that you speak at that church, you wear a coat and a tie. Strange, I wasn't invited back, but what are you going to do? Healthier systems really try to name the unspoken rules, which sounds weird, but as it comes to their attention that there's some things that they're not being clear about, they address them and discover. Now, unhealthy systems will just say, "No, we don't have any unspoken rules. We're open, we're honest here, we're very transparent." Well, maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but anyway, folks, these are some of the. I went through them quickly. Each of these dynamics, you could spend an entire lecture. I've read volumes about each of these particular components, but for purposes of our class, here they are. You're going to want to study them in preparation for paper number 2, where you assess a couple conflicts from a systemic perspective. And if you have any questions at all about any of these components, or questions about your second paper, be sure to email me. Bless you.